Well, thank you everyone for coming on this morning. It's nice to have a small, intimate group sometimes to talk about with these things. I've done webinars like this where you're talking to 300, 400, 500 people, and it becomes a bit impersonal and a bit daunting. So it's nice to be able to just see a smaller group today. So we've got a series of slides we're going to run through. The idea is to provide a bit of an introduction to what the urgency is, so what the climate and ecological emergency is that we all need to change our businesses to help address. Then we'll get into what that means for you as an organisation and the things you can do, and crucially looking at impactful action rather than just doing some stuff. And then there's a little bit at the end we can talk about grants and where Consciam can provide some support. And then the intention is to have time for questions. So I'll probably try and go through the slides quite quickly to make sure we've got time for questions at the end. If you do have thoughts as you go through, by all means whack them in the chat. We'll probably pick them all up at the end, but do put them down while you remember. Otherwise, it's very easy to forget what your question was going to be. So,
just before you go on, is there any chance that you could open up the slides a bit bigger? We're just seeing a bit of a grid at the minute where we can see the next slides as well coming up.
Okay, don't know why that would be. Let's try.
There we go. That's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I can't see my speaker notes now. Don't know why that would be, but anyway, we'll go with that. I'll try and remember what I was going to say as we go through. So quickly, just a little bit about Consciam. So we're an environmental sustainability consultancy, a purpose-led business. So I set the business up 6 years ago, very much for the goal to take my knowledge of corporate environmental sustainability and help smaller businesses to understand, what it is they needed to do, why it was important to make changes around their environmental and social activities, to help them be conscious of their impact. So that's where the name Conscium came from, to be conscious. It's a very crude form of Latin, but to help them understand not only how they impact the environment, but how we all depend on the environment. And we'll come to that a bit more later on. Many of us run businesses that if the natural resources that we sell or use in our products weren't available to us, we wouldn't have a business. So we need to be aware of a changing environment as we go forwards. And we offer a wide range of services related to that. We do an awful lot of work around carbon footprinting, environmental footprinting, so measuring your impacts, which is a really important starting point. Developing reports around that, whether they're formal disclosures or informal company reports, and developing and supporting environmental policies and strategies, net zero strategies, that sort of thing, helping you with compliance assessments, but also looking at B Corporation certification support. So we'll talk a little bit more later about the B Corp movement. And there's just a selection of some of the recent clients I'm working with. So a range from well-known companies like Steel and Bovis Homes to smaller companies, some like Oven Loving in the Bucks area. And my most recent client, Warner's Distillery, which is lovely, working with a gin manufacturer. So, always like to talk about the difference between environmental sustainability and CSR, because sometimes that can be confused. So environmental sustainability is largely talking about the impacts you have on the environment, the impact the environment has on you. So that might be the energy you use in your offices from lighting or heating, or more recently when we're working at home. It could be your business travel, whether that's driving to work, getting the train, flying on business, or the waste that you produce as a business. And often bigger companies in particular will have an ISO 14001 environmental management system that kind of governs a lot of those processes and aims to reduce and prevent pollution. CSR then tends to bring in more of the wider sort of community aspects or internal aspects within the business. So it could be volunteering time, for example, with a local organisation like the Chiltern Rangers. It could be looking at diversion and inclusion within your business, or it could be other aspects of fundraising. So the picture at the bottom is a cycle ride I've been involved in the past, cycling from Windsor Castle to Buckingham Palace, or the other way around. So there's just a subtle distinction, but today we're going to focus on environmental sustainability rather than wider CSR. So quickly, just to reflect on the climate and ecological crises that we face and those that we need to tackle very urgently. over the last sort of few years, we've seen a real change in the way people are protesting about the environment and raising their concerns. We've gone from it being a kind of a niche activity, being involved in environmental protest, to the Extinction Rebellion becoming, you know, a very broad and diverse movement, and people prepared to make huge sacrifices. So I have a good number of friends who've been prepared to go and have themselves arrested, not because they want to cause damage necessarily, but they want to use that as a vehicle to get attention. And we saw it again yesterday with XR active in London, breaking windows at HSBC's offices, very deliberately breaking a window, very carefully, sitting down, waiting to get arrested. So it gets the headlines and it keeps this conversation in the media, which is so important. We've seen Greta Thunberg really change the debate, and I just love the simplicity of her narrative, which is our house is on fire. We need to behave as though our house is on fire and not just wait for somebody else to put it out in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. This biannual State of Nature report showed that 1 in 8 species in the UK and our dependencies are at risk of extinction. And we know that more than a third of every mouthful of food we take depends on pollinators. So if we get to a point that the pollinators, the bees, are not surviving because of the changes we're making to the planet, that will affect us very directly in terms of food availability. And the experts tell us we have less than 10 years to have made these changes, to have driven the necessary action to restore some sort of equilibrium and minimize the worst effects of climate change and the ecological emergency. That's not 10 years to think about it, that's 10 years to have done it. And there's a great saying that the best time to do some work on environmental sustainability was 30 years ago. The second best time is today. So we all need to take much more rapid and much more impactful steps. So very quickly, I love this slide. For those of you who don't know what the greenhouse effect is, it's something we talk about a lot. It's a totally natural process. If it wasn't for the greenhouse effect, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have the ambient temperatures that we have all around the planet. And it's very simple. It works with solar radiation coming in on a lovely sunny day like today. Some of that bounces back off into space. Some of that's absorbed by the land and the sea, and some of it gets trapped in our atmosphere. The problem we've got is that the mechanism for trapping within the atmosphere is caused by greenhouse gases. So that's carbon dioxide, methane, and 4 or 5 other gases that sit in a perfectly normal equilibrium around the planet. By releasing more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we increase the ability of the atmosphere to retain solar radiation, so it gets hotter and hotter and hotter. And I like to liken it to throwing another duvet on your bed. So you might like a 10-tog duvet on your bed at night, and that keeps you at a good comfortable temperature, and you sleep well and you stay healthy. If you put another 10-tog duvet on top, and then another one and another one and another one, you get hotter and hotter, you sleep less well, ultimately you'll become sick. And that's what's happening to the planet as we get more and more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And there's some scary data to support this. So the chart on the left is known as the hockey stick. So this looks at CO2 that's been trapped in ice cores over the last 800,000 years or so. And you can see that there's been a natural variation between sort of 200 and 300 parts per million of carbon dioxide for nearly 1 million years. Come the Industrial Revolution, we've then seen this hockey stick. It's just going up and up and up. Currently, it's north of 400 parts per million of CO2. And the chart on the right is showing some observed data. This is sampled at Mauna Loa in Hawaii every day. And the data in the green box at the bottom shows the value 10 years ago was at 392 parts per million. A year ago, it was 414 parts per million. And in mid-February, it was at 416. So we're seeing this just exponential rise in carbon dioxide concentrations as a result of human activities. Oh, why can't I go to the next slide? Oh, there we go. And what does that mean? Well, there's a direct link between carbon dioxide concentrations and global temperatures. So as we've seen an increase in carbon dioxide, global temperatures have increased, and we're currently at just over 1 degree above what's called pre-industrial levels. 1 degree doesn't sound like very much, but as you'll see in a chart at the moment, that has pretty profound effects for the planet. Back in 2015, we had the landmark Paris Agreement, at the COP conference, and there's another COP26, which you'll have been heard talked about in Glasgow this year, where all the countries in the world come together and make commitments, good or bad, around climate change. 2015 was a landmark, and the countries agreed to limit changing to no more than 2 degrees, and warming to no more than 2 degrees, and ideally less than 1.5 degrees. What we can see already is we're north of 1 degree. This chart on the right is slightly out of date, but based on pledges in 2018, we would get to 2.9 degrees. So that's not enough. Then there's the problem of pledges are one thing, but action is clearly the other. And based on current policies that are in place in the world at that point, we'd be heading for more like 3.5 degrees of warming. And if countries don't do anything, we'll be at 4.5 degrees of warming. So what does that mean? Well, if you go around this chart sort of clockwise, we're not going to go through all of this, but in the sort of 0.8 to 1 degrees, so the blue and the start of the red, what we start to see is some species becoming extinct, which we've already seen, and I talked earlier about the forecast for that as we go forwards. We see more and more extreme weather events. So we talk a lot about weather in the UK because of where we fit in the sort of global weather systems. We see sort of weather more than climate, but we're seeing increasingly drier spells and increasingly wetter spells and increasingly hotter spells and colder spells. Our weather's becoming more and more extreme. You know, every year there seems to be, it's been the hottest winter, the coldest winter, the wettest winter, the whatever it might be, and that's a direct link to climate change. But we don't feel it as bad here as many countries do around the world. As we head up towards 2 degrees, we see mass extinction of species. We see water supplies getting increasingly affected around the world, and the wars of the future will be around water availability rather than oil as they've been in the past. We see a massive increase in people having to relocate and environmental refugees. So there's a lot of predictions that say North Africa, Southern Europe will become too hot and too dry to live in within the next 20 to 30 years, which will have huge implications for people wanting to relocate. And then as we go north into the top left-hand corner, well, we don't want to go there. We're talking the life on Earth becoming largely untenable for us and many other species. So it's a bit sort of doom and gloom, but then it's, you know, so what does this mean to you as a business community rather than individuals? Well, what we're seeing is things are changing incredibly rapidly for the business community, and we can bring that up to date with yesterday, where we saw global leaders getting together and talking about the importance of climate change and tightening their commitments. So in the UK, we've seen an intention to bring significant carbon reductions forward by 15 years. Now, that's only going to happen if that's followed by legislation and changes in behaviour by businesses, behaviour by individuals. But some of those things we'll just have to do. So if your business is currently set up and predicated on a version of legislation that doesn't recognise that we're going to see cuts in carbon, and that will be driven by, say, legislation, but almost certainly taxes will go up on carbon-intensive businesses and waste-intensive businesses, then you'll be in trouble as an organisation. We're seeing that played out through changes in customer preferences as well and requirements. So, you know, more and more, you know, you can look at the adverts on the TV some evenings and they'll realise that 3 or 4 out of 5 adverts in a break all have some link to sustainability. Now, a bunch of that might be greenwash, which is a real concern to me, and something obviously I encourage businesses to avoid. But it just shows that businesses are starting to understand that customers don't just want to buy the iPhone anymore. They want to buy something which they know is more sustainable and has less impact and more aligns with their needs as a person. And through the Blue Planet a couple of years ago, we saw in one episode of the Blue Planet, David Attenborough showed a dying whale calf, and that triggered a massive change in people's behaviour around plastics, which many companies are still struggling to keep up with. So it has some real impact for businesses. There's a lot of data to show how much employees want to work for purpose-led businesses and are increasingly voting with their feet. They want to be proud of the organisations they work for, and they don't want to be contributing to climate change, ecological issues and inequality challenges by working for businesses that are refusing to change. And the investor community has woken up to this as well. So there's been a real shift in the way financial markets are working, and they've started to understand what we've talked about for a long time in this sector around stranded assets, that you may well be investing in a business that has very great returns today, but they can look forward 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it may be, and see that that business will either not exist in all likelihood, or it simply won't be able to have the returns on investment that it would if it was a more environmentally focused business or socially focused business. So the investors are increasingly starting to shift money into businesses that they know will give them in returns on investment in the future. And I've already talked a bit about legislation around how that's starting to change more and more. So for bigger companies, so companies greater than SMEs, you now have to, as part of your annual director's report as a limited company, you have to complete a thing called the streamlined energy and carbon reporting statement. So that's probably a couple of pages that goes in your accounts that shows that you measure your impacts, you understand what your impacts are, and you're doing something about it. So the business case for action, we've talked to a little bit about that as we've gone through there, but there's a real focus on a business that understands its environmental impacts, its social impacts, is increasingly going to be reducing its risks as an organization, and it's going to improve its resilience as they go forward. So the last 12 months have showed us that we've seen unprecedented change, unprecedented challenges to businesses, but many of those that have survived and are now thriving have done that because they've done some thinking up front. They've been able to adjust to changing circumstances. And that's the approach we need to take when we think about climate change. We need to treat it in the same way as a critical emergency, and it will make you a more resilient business. In many cases, the focus on sustainability can save money. You may need to invest, but there's very often grants available, as Maxine has said, and I'll touch on towards the end. But very often you'll find that simply by looking at energy efficiency within a business, you can save an awful lot of money. So in my days working for a big company, Capgemini, we were saving millions of pounds by focusing on turning off lighting and turning heating down and other aspects of energy efficiency. And I would sit in the boardroom and talk about environmental sustainability and look around the room, 10 or 12 people, and I could look at some of those, the financial director, for example. I'll talk about an environmental initiative that I wanted to drive through in the business, and I would talk to him about cost. I'll talk to the company secretary about the same initiative that I wanted to drive through, but I'll talk to her about reducing risk in the business and ensuring that we remained compliant. I might talk to somebody in the HR team and we'd reflect on what that would mean for employees. Someone from representing the sales community would be excited about what we now be able to talk to our clients about in a different way and articulate what we want to do about sustainability, and we can seize new opportunities with clients. And we very much saw that, and I see that more and more with companies these days. And it's really important to see the value in your business case of engaging your stakeholders. This week it's not environmental, but we've seen, for anyone who's vaguely interested in football, and I don't really count myself in that, but the plans to launch a European Super League utterly failed around stakeholder engagement. They didn't go out and talk to the fans. They didn't go out and talk to other people about what it would mean to be a different business going forward. And it's the same with sustainability. Go and talk to your stakeholders, understand what it is they want from you as an organization, understand what they're worried about. And those stakeholders might be your clients, they might be suppliers, they could be employees, investors, or your local community. It's really important to go and talk to those people and understand, what it means to them for you to be a more purposeful business and more aware going forwards. Maxine, I'll just pause quickly there. The way I'm sharing my screen, I can't see if there's any questions coming in, but I'll keep talking unless you shout.
Yeah, we're good at the moment. No questions. I think everyone's engrossed with the presentation. So
engrossed, I hope. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's just some example of some of the responses that companies can take. So we have the B Corporation, which I talked about earlier. So B Corp is a third-party certification. It's a global system with around 4,000 B Corps now around the world, just over 500 in the UK and growing very rapidly. But it's you complete a detailed assessment that says how you're running your business around key impact areas, the environment, society, your customers, your workers. You have to get to a threshold of points, but what's really interesting is this B economy is starting up. So there are now companies that are choosing to put a desire to buy from a B Corp into their procurement policies. And there are many B Corps offering lots of different services. I'm a B leader, so I'm trained to help companies to get through that process. And Muriel, who's on the call as well, is also a B leader. So two good people to talk to if you want to know more about that. More locally, we have the CSR accreditation. So that's based in Buckinghamshire, run by CSRA, and that's sort of I don't want to call it a light version of B Corp. That's unfair, but it's less challenging, but still a really good process to go through to help you understand what good can look like within business and be recognised and rewarded for the great work that you're doing as an organisation. We've had the Net Zero Bucks initiative. The Net Zero Bucks initiative that was started by Bucks Business First last year, encouraging businesses to drive towards a net zero future. And we have initiatives like the science-based targets. So science-based targets is interesting because it says rather than as an organisation me saying I'll do 2% less carbon emissions next year, this is a method and there's an online toolkit to help you do this that says to get to a safe net zero point following a 1.5 degree target trajectory, this is how much you need to cut your carbon emissions by year on year on year on year. So it's a much more science-led approach to doing that and therefore much more useful and impactful. And we have things like the CDP disclosure. So again, particularly bigger businesses will often find themselves asked to submit to the Carbon Disclosure Project, and this is where you declare what you're doing as a business, and it's used by your investor community often to judge your performance and whether that's whether you're a business they may want to invest in. We have the framework of the SDGs there on the right hand side, so this selection of 17 goals. These are primarily set to help countries align to drive down impacts across the full spectrum of sustainability by 2030. But you can apply them in your business, and lots do. So you'll probably see these logos come up in corporate sustainability, and it's kind of a nice way to focus attention. And then there's people looking to go beyond doing a bit less bad. So rather than just drive down your carbon by 2% a year or whatever a science-based target might tell you, companies that are looking to have a net impact. So that's where you're saying, I've measured and I'm going to reduce my impacts as much as I can, but I'm also going to have a very deliberate positive impact, whether that's environmentally or socially or both. So an example, going back to my Capgemini days, for example, we looked at our carbon footprint. It was 50,000 tons for our business. But as a big IT provider, we realized we could re-architect our clients' IT solutions, and we could reduce their environmental footprint by them having less energy used in running their IT systems. So Capgemini committed to reducing client carbon footprint by 150,000 tons, so 3 times our own footprint. So aiming to have a positive impact rather than just doing a bit less bad. And this Wordle at the bottom there, that's from a conference I run every year, and we're running in about a month's time as a virtual event again, where we bring all of the key stakeholders globally together to talk about different ways of driving net impact within businesses. So sort of going back to, so what can you do? What does it look like? What are the practical steps you can take as a business? Everything seems to need a 4-step model. So this is perhaps my version of that as Consciam. So you can't do anything without understanding what your impacts are at the moment. So doing some work to measure your carbon footprint is a really good place to be. I offer a carbon footprinting service using a tool that I developed with the help of Bucks Business First, actually, last year. But you don't have to. If that's too complicated, you can simply look at what you spend as a business. You can start to look at your accounts, where do we spend our most money? And that will give you a bit of a clue, as long as it's not just salaries, as to where you're having an environmental impact. And quite often that will be the energy you use as a business. And you can start to track that over time, and you can start to see the benefits and how much money you would save by spending less on energy, by being more energy efficient as a business. And then you can start to look, as I mentioned earlier, around what your dependencies are as a business. And by having looked at that, by having calculated your carbon footprint, having looked at how you depend on the environment, you can then look at what's called materiality. So that's when you say, I can see my biggest impact from the environment is the raw materials we buy as a business, the plastic we buy as a business. and maybe our business travel. Our office energy is actually quite small. So I'm going to focus on driving down my impacts in the most material way. So I won't spend a lot of money on office energy. I'll spend that money on how I can make my product in a more sustainable way, or how I can reduce my business travel footprint. So it's spending money in the right places, having a real impactful change. And then looking at your supply chain. So it's not just about what you do as a direct operation, what's happening in the products that I buy, but also what's happening in the products that I sell. So thinking back to that Capgemini example where we identified that we could help our clients save a lot of energy, and you see lots of different examples with people like the Body Shop, for example, talking about packaging that's been made in a way that will have less impact at the end of life, or which is much more easy for you to recycle at home. And then being aware of what legislation is going to affect you as a business, either now or in the future. As I said earlier, understanding what your stakeholders might want from you. So having done some thinking, and I encourage companies not to spend too much time on the thinking stage, because we need to get into acting, come up with a bit of a plan. What's your ambition going to be? Do you want to be net zero by a certain time in the future? Do you want to utterly change your business model or your production models to make yourself a much more sustainable business? And come up with some objectives and targets that align to that are challenging, but obviously reasonable for your business as well, but very much still aligns to, we have to do more, we have to do better, we have to do it quickly. And then making sure that's wrapped up in policy within your business, and developing an environmental policy. More than happy to help you do that. But again, there's lots of good examples out there. You don't have to employ someone like me to help you come up with a policy. It's simply a statement of, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to make sure that happens, by ensuring we've got good governance within our business, that we're communicating with our senior leaders, and we're communicating with our stakeholders. And making sure you've got some budget, because nothing happens within a business unless you allocate some budget. But you may find, by saving some money on reduced travel costs or reduced energy, you then provide budget to be able to do other things you'd want to do. And like I said, just start, get going, switch to a green renewable tariff, and we'll come to some of these things in a moment, but find those quick wins, do them, start them tomorrow, and then start to look at some of those longer term projects that you can get into. And I talked about communicating, really important then to share what you're doing with others, whether that's your employees or your wider community, because to me, there's never any harm in you earning credit from talking about the great things you're doing. And to me, that's a really good reason to do it, is to boost your business as well as doing the right things. And as long as it's driven by you're doing the good things, the right things as well, then that passes the greenwash test. So some quick wins for smaller businesses. Just conscious of time, and I want to have time for any questions you might have. So if we focus on carbon, which tends to be the biggest impact for a lot of businesses, have a look at what your energy use is. Now that could just be going back over your energy bills for the last few years. More often than not now, we get energy bills that are broken down on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis. So you can start to really track how you're performing. Just build a spreadsheet, if nothing else, so you can see what you're doing. And then you can start to see the impact of making sure that you've turned off equipment that you don't need to be on. You've made sure the lights are turned off before everybody leaves in the evening. Some of this goes back to when we're back in offices rather than working from home. But don't forget, if you've got employees working from home, they're still having a carbon impact. It's just coming off their home electricity bill rather than your business electricity bill. So you can do work with your employees to encourage them to understand what they can do at home to minimize their impacts. I talked about renewable tariff. So for a lot of people, this is a really good quick win, is to switch away from a standard brown electricity tariff that you might have, move on to a green energy tariff. There's some devil in the detail around making sure you get a good tariff. And companies like Ecotricity and Good Energy are particularly strong. But Octopus are also very good, and Bulb are improving. But just watch out for some of the renewable tariffs offered by some of the big 6 companies, because they're actually not really making a difference. They're just buying what are called REGO certificates on the market that allow them to say that the energy you're using is backed by renewables. It's not the best way to do it. Still better than nothing. And reducing business travel and commuting is really important. So this one fascinates me. I've spent the last 10 years telling companies that they need to travel less. You really don't need to constantly be jumping in a car, jumping on a plane to do business. You can use video conferencing. And what we saw over the last 12 months is companies pivoting very rapidly to a very different way of operating. And those companies will have saved, in some cases, many millions of pounds. And I heard the chief executive of Unilever talking recently, and he was talking about how cross he was when he realizes how much time and money his employees have wasted traveling when they could have been using Zoom and other video conferencing tools. Still need to travel, you still need to have FaceTime with clients, but just not as much. So it's going to be fascinating to see, as restrictions end, whether this changes. I think we'll see companies do a lot less traveling going forward and save a lot of money. And then hybrid and electric vehicles is often a win. We're seeing increasing numbers of suitable vehicles on the market. It's not always a straight buy an electric vehicle, because if you don't drive very much, it's better not to have a vehicle at all rather than go and buy a brand new car that's just been made and has a lot of embodied carbon in it, but always worth thinking about. On waste and materials, the simple answer is to just buy less stuff. At a personal level, for many of us, probably 30 to 40% of our carbon footprint is just stuff. It's not your travel, it's not your home electric or gas, it's just the things you buy, whether it's clothes or electrical items, and just challenging within your business. Do we really need these things? And if we do, can I make sure I buy things that are reusable, that have been built in a recyclable way, or just have a lower impact, or simply last longer, so that you need to buy less of them? And making sure you're really clear on how your business is affected by waste legislation. There is a raft of legislation as businesses, and again, we need to think about this as home working businesses. You're still an organisation, you're still required to comply by waste legislation. But there's lots of guidance again around this, and again, I can always give some help and advice on that. So help and advice, neatly segueing. So this is the last slide then before we can get into some questions. So Consciam is here to help as much as we can. We always provide free initial consultations for anybody. I'm a bit of a sucker for small businesses as well, so I'm always happy to help where I can if budgets can be a challenge. But as I said earlier, we provide a wide range of support, from helping you measure those impacts in the first place to then helping you develop the policies and the processes to drive change. And we talked about the low carbon workspaces. So this is a brilliant and underused grant scheme. So if you are looking to make changes within your business, they can fund, I think it's up to a third of the capital cost of certain energy efficiency measures that you want to put in, and they can also help and guide you as to what is the right thing to do. So I'm talking with a couple of my clients at the moment about how they're going to work with the low carbon workspaces team, and they're getting really good advice and really valuing that. So give them a call and they'll help you if they can. So my contact details, and I'll stop sharing in just a second, just in case anyone wants to scribble that down, and then we can get into some questions. I hope that's provided some food for thought.
Great, thanks, Phil. Just while anyone's jotting down some contact details, Muriel did put in the chat room, could you expand on the electric vehicles? It's quite a controversial solution to carbon reduction. Are you able to?
Yeah, it's one of these things that, personally, I think is a really good idea. We have to move to electrification of vehicles because there are two key problems related to vehicle use. One is the CO2 emissions that come from the tailpipe, which contributes to global warming, climate change, and the second is the air quality, the pollution aspect. And we saw the headlines recently about the poor girl in London who has become the first person in the UK to have poor air quality as a cause of death on her death certificate. If you do a lot of urban driving, then having an electric vehicle is a great idea, because you don't then emit nitrogen oxides, which cause a lot of the air quality issues, and we see that locally. I'm running an air quality study for one of the local authorities around here, and we just see spikes of challenging air quality during the rush hour every day. So that's a really good scenario to move to an electric vehicle. If you don't drive very much at all, buying an electric vehicle is a disaster, because there's a huge amount of energy goes into creating an electric vehicle. There's some rare earth metals that have to be put into making the battery that go into it. So it's like lots of things, this kind of buy less stuff thing. If you need a car, if you really need a car, then look at an electric vehicle or a hybrid, but still use it as little as you can. The last thing to add on that is there's an international aspect to it around energy. So an electric vehicle isn't powered by fairies, it's powered by electricity. That electricity has to be generated somewhere. And this is where some of the difficult headlines around EVs come in. So there were some studies recently last year that talked about a Tesla having greater environmental impacts than a petrol vehicle. Well, they'd based that on studies in Germany and in America, where the predominant source of electricity was coal-fired power stations. In the UK, we very rarely burn coal now. We use a small amount of gas and increasing amount of renewables. So our grid here is actually relatively low carbon. So an EV becomes a better option in many respects. Sorry, long answer to a simple question.
I think Muriel was satisfied with that answer as well. Thanks, Phil.
Yeah, Zipcar is it's one of the things that fascinates me about autonomous vehicles. So the idea of this Tesla is the one we tend to talk about at the moment that can drive itself. But we will increasingly, I think, in the next 5 to 10 years, get to models where you may choose to buy a car, an electric vehicle, but you'll say, actually, I only need this car between 9 and 10 a.m. and 4 and 6 p.m. And the rest of the day, somebody else can have it. So I could be in a car club like Zipcar or something else with Muriel, and Muriel could go onto an app on the phone and she could say, well, I need a car to pop from wherever to wherever, and my car will disappear off my drive, and it'll go to Muriel's house, it'll pick Muriel up, Muriel will drive somewhere, and it'll be back on my drive, and I'll earn some money while my car is out. So, but that means there's just less cars on the road, and that's where we can use technology to get to some of these good solutions going forwards.
Really interesting about the Zipcar. I like that. That's yeah, I think I'll be looking into that a lot more. Everybody else, please feel free to unmute and put questions forward to Phil or myself.